various aspects. I think it's very appropriate that the last one, we're going to learn how to do proper statistical inference and get into the statistical rigor we needed for all the other things we learned. I'm happy to introduce Lucas. Lucas Janson is just higher, right? This is your first semester at Harvard. He is an assistant professor, Department of Statistics. He did his PhD at Stanford with Emmanuel Candes. His research is in methodology of high dimension inference, robust machine learning, and autonomous robotic motion. I'm sure that's just part of what you do. I grab it from the web. Please help me to welcome Lucas.
Thanks a lot. Can people hear me? Is this? Yeah, it sounds like this thing is working. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here to talk to a very different audience, I think, than I'm usually used to. And in that vein, I would like to ask a couple of clarifying questions. Can people raise their hand if they know what I mean by a GLM? Okay, most people. And how many people know what exchangeable random variables are? Yeah, okay. Great. That just gives me a little bit of a gauge for what terms I can use and what not. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about doing variable selection, especially in high dimensional and nonlinear models, which means I want to find important variables for determining some outcome of interest. And I should definitely say that this is joint work with my advisor from Stanford and two collaborators, Yingying Fan and Jinchi Liu at USC Marshall. All right, so what is this problem statement? It's what I call control variable selection. So I'm assuming that you're given some y, which is an outcome of interest, or a response or dependent variable, and x1 through xp, a set of p potential explanatory variables for explaining y. And I might call those covariates, features, or independent variables. And the fundamental high-level question is, how can we select important explanatory variables while making few mistakes? And so this is a pretty ubiquitous problem in modern statistical applications, because there's often just a lot of variables and we need to do some kind of reduction. We don't really believe that all of them are important for explaining our response. So in medicine and healthcare, you might imagine that you have electronic health records, which have lots and lots of data points collected about each person. And you want to know the relationship between those electronic health records and someone's future disease status or future costs. In genomics, we have lots of genomic variables, such as expression levels or mutations along the genome, and you want to know which ones of those are related to perhaps a disease or a continuous phenotype like cholesterol level. In economics and political science, you have lots of variables, socioeconomic and demographic in nature, and you want to understand their relationship with maybe future income or political affiliation. And in industry and technology, you might think about looking at users' browser behavior or how they've interacted with your website before. And that's, again, going to be a very high-dimensional space. There's lots of things you could collect about those people. And asking, which ones of those behaviors are important for determining whether that user is going to click on your ad or buy something from your website or just engage with your website in general. And so this is just a few examples, but I think this comes up a lot. Hopefully you guys have seen in your research problems like this, so you can sort of have something like that in mind as you listen to this talk. All right, so let me tell you what I mean by an important variable. So explicitly, I'm going to define an unimportant variable to be one that is not contained in the conditional distribution of y given the rest of the x's. So I'm assuming that y and x's are all drawn from some big p+1 dimensional distribution, which means that y given x1 through xp is a well-defined conditional distribution that completely defines how y is related or can be determined from x1 through xp. And so that conditional distribution defines how the x1 through xp explain the y, the response. And so the question is, in a problem where we have a lot of covariates, can we actually throw away a bunch of those covariates and still have the same amount of explanatory power? And the way I can define this mathematically is by looking at that conditional distribution function of y given x1 through xp and seeing that actually it can be written as only a function of a subset of the x's. So maybe there's just 10 x's which actually have an influence on y, and we can throw the rest away and you get the exact same conditional distribution function. Now formally this is exactly equivalent to asking for each j whether y is conditionally independent of xj given x minus j, and I'm just using R notation. X minus j means all the variables except for the jth. Okay, so these are just mathematical. This is just mathematical formalism for saying the exact same thing. And so under very mild assumptions, the set of all important variables defined this way. So this is all the unimportant variables if they're conditionally independent of y. So all the ones that are conditionally dependent on y constitute the Markov blanket, which is the unique smallest set S, such that y is conditionally independent of all the variables not in the Markov blanket, given all the variables in the Markov blanket. And so to me, this is a very intuitive and natural definition of important variables, because it means that if you give me y and a whole bunch of these x's, all of these x's, and you tell me what the Markov blanket is, I actually know that I can throw away every single variable that's not in the Markov blanket without losing any explanatory power for y, given the x's. And I know that as soon as I throw away any variable in the Markov blanket, I have immediately lost information about y. I've strictly decreased the amount that I'm able to predict or understand y given the x's. Okay, so that's my definition. You'll note that it doesn't depend on any model for y given x. It's completely model free in the y given x space. It's going to be well defined no matter what. And for, yeah, question? It is under some very, very mild conditions. So if you have, for instance, completely redundant features, so if xj equals xj minus 1, then it's not unique, because then it's not clear which one to include. But assuming that you will see if you have completely redundant features and you can throw them away, or that your features are in sort of general stochastic position, it'll be unique. Yeah. Okay, so for those of you, it seems like most of you who are familiar with GLMs, which is sort of the standard approach to variable selection, is to find the variables which have non-zero coefficients in your generalized linear model. This is a strict generalization of that definition, which is that when the GLMs, again, have no stochastically redundant covariates, then this is exactly equivalent to the null hypothesis that beta j equals 0 in your generalized linear model. So if we assume a linear model, I'm testing the exact same hypotheses as you would in the normal linear model setting, but my definition of an important variable extends to any model. So it doesn't depend on the linear model. Okay, so then controlled variable selection, there's also the control part. So what's the control I'm going to try and get? Is I want to control what I'm calling the false discovery rate. I'm calling it. I'm certainly not the one who invented false discovery rate, but this is the false discovery rate. It's the expected fraction of falsely discovered variables divided by the total number of discovered variables. And so there's an expectation outside, so that this is a well-defined quantity. Of course, the inside of this thing is called the false discovery proportion, and that's a random quantity. So it's hard for me to control that. I'm going to control its expectation below some small level, say 10%, so that a scientist gives me their data with a whole bunch of x's and a y, and I come back to them and say, okay, here's a set S hat of variables, and I expect 90% of them to be important. And then they can go off and interpret that at will or follow up with those variables with different, more low-dimensional experiments, et cetera. All right, so this is an interpretable error rate. It's a fairly powerful error rate. And so this is going to be our goal, to control this error rate so that we don't make too many mistakes. Okay, so a sneak peek of what I'm going to tell you for the rest of this talk. ModelX Knockoffs, which is the method that I'm talking about, that I've proposed. It uses knowledge of X's distribution to solve the controlled variable selection problem for any model for y and x1 through xp. So I put no constraint on the model, on the distribution jointly between y and x. It doesn't have any constraint on the dimension. So p, the number of variables, can be much larger than the number of samples. Of course, it can be smaller as well. Doesn't matter. And we're going to get finite sample control. So this is exact control of the false discovery rate in finite samples is non-asymptotic. And lastly, we get practical performance on real problems, by which I mean it's powerful. So I don't just control these things, I actually make a lot of discoveries. And I can touch on that last point a little bit because we actually applied this to a genome-wide association study data set where we had about 5,000 subjects, so that's N, and about 400,000 single nucleotide polymorphisms, so that's P. And so these are just, each one of these is a location on the genome where you either have 0, 1, or 2 mutations. And we want to know, which of those mutations is important for determining, in this case, Crohn's disease. So it's just a 0, 1 response variable. So clearly this is going to be a nonlinear relationship since my outcome is binary. And so when the original authors of that paper in 2007 presented this data set and analyzed it, they used marginal p-values. So they were testing really whether y and x are just marginally independent as opposed to conditionally independent. And they made 9 discoveries, and they were targeting a false discovery rate of about 10%. When we ran our method, we made about twice as many discoveries with the same targeted false discovery rate. And there's actually a later study in, I think, 2014 that had about 10 times as many subjects and analyzed the same disease and the same SNPs. And it found, of course, a lot more things. And so we were able to confirm a lot of the new discoveries we made in that larger study. So it seems like we're not doing something too crazy. We're actually increasing power over a previous approach. And we have some very strong guarantees on the statistical errors that we're making. OK, so I'm going to very briefly review existing methods for variable selection to try and distinguish my approach. So in a linear model in low dimension, so you have more observations than variables, certainly not the case in a genome-wide association study right now. And you assume a linear model, so y's expectation is linear, and then it has Gaussian errors, which are independent and all have the same variance. Then this is a classical problem. You use ordinary least squares theory to get exact p-values for testing whether each coefficient is 0, which again, under the linear model, is equivalent to my null hypothesis that y and xj are conditionally independent given the other x's. And once I have those p-values, I can plug them into what's called the Benjamini-Hochberg procedure, which is a procedure that applies to a set of p-values. You give it a bunch of p-values, and it spits out a subset of those p-values, which you can determine to be significant, and it controls the false discovery rate. Now, technically, the false discovery rate isn't exactly guaranteed to be controlled because it requires certain distributional assumptions on the p-values. They have to be, for instance, independent or have positive dependence. And in general, those assumptions are not actually met for linear regression p-values. However, they're pretty close, and actually BHQ is quite robust. So in practice, this thing works pretty well. So we have a good solution in the low-dimensional Gaussian linear model, homoscedastic Gaussian linear model. However, when we make the problem even just slightly harder, so we move from a linear model to a generalized linear model, then we still are able to get p-values, but now they're asymptotic p-values. Excuse me, we need to use asymptotic MLE theory to get our p-values from, say, a likelihood ratio test. And so those p-values actually, unfortunately, can be very bad in reasonable dimensions that aren't very low dimensional. So when n, the asymptotics, of course, are as n goes to infinity and p stays fixed. So here's an example with n is more than twice p, so n equals 500, p equals 200. And this is a histogram of null p-values in this problem. So this, of course, should be uniform if these were valid p-values. But these are very, very far from uniform. You can see there's a huge spike at 0, which is exactly what you don't want. It's going to make it look like these null p-values are much more significant than they actually are. And so, as you might expect, plugging these highly invalid p-values into a procedure like BHQ is going to not give you false discovery rate control. Of course, what you plug into the procedure has to be valid p-values, regardless of the dependence. So you have this issue that even in low dimensions, when we move to a generalized linear model, it's not really clear how we can control the false discovery rate unless p is really, really small compared to n. And this is becoming less and less the case in modern applications. As you might expect, things don't get any easier when we now make the problem high dimensional. So when we have n less than p and we're in a generalized linear model, now we can't even apply asymptotic maximum likelihood theory because the maximum likelihood estimators aren't even well defined. But there's been a lot of interesting work in the last few years by some people in statistics, some people in causal inference and econometrics, and some other people in statistics, all trying to get sort of back to the asymptotic p-value guarantees you get in low dimensions, but in high dimensions. And in order to get there, they are still using asymptotics, although now n and p are both going to infinity together. But they're requiring very strong sparsity assumptions, something called ultra-sparsity, to distinguish it from the regular sparsity regime, where something like the lasso, for instance, is consistent. That's actually even already a much weaker assumption. Ultra-sparsity is a very strong assumption on sparsity. And then they make certain random design assumptions. And under those assumptions, they do get asymptotically valid p-values. However, again, those assumptions are quite strong. And just like we have this problem in finite samples here, when you're actually in a finite sample setting, these can be very biased, and you get very invalid p-values. OK, so just to summarize quickly, these are sort of the things we might care about, the properties of methods. So do we require low dimensions? Do we require a model for y? Do we require asymptotics, sparsity, random design? So in a low-dimensional linear model, we can use OLS, p-values, and Benjamini-Hochberg procedure, and we can solve the problem as long as we're in low dimensions and have a linear model. Moving to the generalized linear model, we need these asymptotics, and as we saw in the histogram on the previous slide, that can be a big problem in real problems. Moving to high dimensions, we've of course removed the requirement on high dimensions, but we've added all these new requirements and sort of have the same problem as the previous row. What I want to talk to you about today is generally this framework of knockoffs, which was first proposed in 2015 by my advisor and one of his postdocs. And their original knockoffs paper was actually proposed as a method for variable selection in the low-dimensional linear model. So the exact same setting as the first row here, so again, that's sort of a solved problem, although they're able to get a little bit stronger guarantees and more power. But essentially, they're solving the same low-dimensional homoscedastic Gaussian linear model problem for variable selection. What I'm going to talk about today is my method, also with my advisor and two collaborators at USC, which is called ModelX Knockoffs. And we take a very different approach than the original knockoffs method in terms of the philosophy of what stochasticity we are controlling an error rate over. And the result is that we make no requirement on the dimensions on a model for Y. This non-asymptotic guarantee is just like the original knockoffs and no sparsity requirements. But we are going to require this random design assumption because we're shifting the burden of knowledge from Y given X onto the distribution of X. And I'm going to certainly talk about that more in the rest of the talk. Okay, so what is this knockoffs idea? I'm going to go over this slide pretty quickly because it's just summarizing the paper really that came before our paper, so a little less relevant, but I want you to see a couple of things. So first, some notation. Bold Y and bold X are going to be the actual vectors of observed values as opposed to the random variables represented by capital non-bold Y and capital XJ. And the design matrix will be the concatenation of all those columns, the n by p matrix of x1 through xp. Okay, so the knockoffs procedure is a three-step procedure, or it can be thought of that way. And in the original proposal, the first step is you construct knockoffs, which means you take your original columns of your design matrix, and for each of those columns, you construct a knockoff of that column. And that knockoff has to have some special properties. In fact, jointly, they need to have some special properties. And for the original problem, this is the property it needed to have. So the x tilde is your knockoff design matrix. And so we concatenate it with the original design matrix to make this augmented n by 2p design matrix. And it needs to have this geometric property. So, and the S, I haven't told you what S is, but there just needs to be an S such that this holds. And of course, this has to be positive definite. We want S to be as big as possible because that's sort of the difference between your original variable and the knockoff variable. And you want the two to be as different as possible so that you can distinguish the original variable from the knockoff variable. You're actually going to use the knockoff variable as something like a control for your original variable to really see which one is important. All right, so in step 2, once you have those knockoffs, what you want to do is compute a measure of the relative importance of the original variable as versus the knockoff variable. And again, in the original proposal, this meant that you had to compute some function of all the data for each j, get these scalar wj's, which could only be a function of these functions of the data, which makes sense because these are the sufficient statistics in a Gaussian linear model. So in some sense, this contains all the information about the data that there is. And then you also need this anti-symmetry property that when you swap xj and xj tilde, you flip the sign of wj. So that's what you need. And then finally, in this third step, you take these wj's, these variable, these knockoff statistics, and you put them into what in statistics we usually call a step-down procedure. But that, of course, would apply to p-values. And this is applying to non-p-values. The w can be positive and negative. They're certainly not p-values. But you put them into this step-down procedure, and by that I mean I'm going to order them by decreasing absolute value. And then I'm going to go down the list and keep rejecting any positive wj's. So I've also kept track of their sign, but they're only ordered by their absolute value. And I'm going to reject the positive ones until the last time that the ratio of negatives to positives that I've passed so far stays below Q, the nominal false discovery rate. And I'm, again, going to go a lot more into all of these things, but these are the three basic steps. A couple notes is that it achieved finite sample false discovery rate control, and this is exact guarantees as opposed to the Benjamini-Hochberg applied to OLS p-values approach. But it does require the data follow a low-dimensional Gaussian linear model, which severely limits its applications to modern applications in high dimensions and for nonlinear problems, like when you have a binary response. Another thing that I want to point out, because it's the big distinction between this approach and our approach, is that it takes, I think at least in statistics, what I would call the canonical approach, where all the modeling assumptions are put on y given x, and nothing is assumed about the distribution of x. In fact, x is conditioned on in the inference. So it's treated as completely fixed. And so all the inference is done over the randomness in y given x, which means you need a model for y given x. And of course, y given x is also the thing that we're asking a question about, right? Sort of by asking this question in the first place, we're admitting some sort of ignorance of y given x. And so this is the canonical approach. What we're going to do is flip that on its head a little. Before we do that, I want to generalize this idea. So there were some specific descriptions of how to do steps 1 through 3, but I want to generalize what's really fundamental to the knockoffs approach in these steps. So in step 1, as I said, you just need some artificial versions of the original variables. And you need them to act as controls for assessing the importance of the original variables. And I'm being deliberately a little bit vague here. This is not a mathematical definition, it's an intuitive definition of step 1. In step 2, I need to compute a scalar statistic for each variable that measures how much more important the original variable is than its knockoff version. And we want it to be set up so that positive wj corresponds to the original looking more important than the knockoff variable, and vice versa, with magnitude representing the strength of the difference. So if I see a large positive wj, then it looks like my original variable looks a lot more important than my knockoff variable. And then step 3 is exactly the same as before. You put it through this step-up procedure that's going to spit out a set of wj's, and then you're going to take the indices of those wj's, and that'll be your selected set. All right, but really what's the fundamental property of these 3 steps is that steps 1 and 2 need to be done in such a way as to ensure this coin flipping property. And this is, I think, really the fundamental idea behind knockoffs, is that you need that the wj's have the property that conditional on all the absolute values of the wj's, and that's what you use to order them, conditional on all those absolute values, the signs of the null wj are IAD coin flips. So this sounds a little bit like what we require out of p-values, right? With p-values, we assume that for a valid p-value that we know the distribution under the null of a p-value. That's what a p-value is, right? But we assume that null distribution is a uniform distribution. Here I'm assuming sort of a different null distribution. And I'm assuming something, I'm not assuming, but I'm constructing things in such a way that I actually get a much stronger property, which is that not only do I have marginal plus or minus 1 with probability half, so not only do I have a marginal known distribution for my null wj's, conditional on their absolute values, I actually have independence among those null wj's. And that's really, really important, and I think really counterintuitive, because we started with this problem that may have complicated dependence between the xj's. They could be highly correlated. There could be some complicated model between the y's and the x's. And we've managed to spit out now things that sort of act a little bit like p-values, except that I'm actually guaranteeing that they're independent. And that's going to make my life a lot easier because, in fact, as long as we have this coin flipping property, step 3 is going to give us exact false discovery rate control. So that's really the key. And the question will be, how do we generalize this procedure to high-dimensional problems, nonlinear problems, where we still want steps 1 and 2 to give us the coin flipping property? All right, so that's where ModelX Knockoffs comes in. And the key innovation, as I mentioned, is to shift the burden of knowledge from y onto x. And when we do that, we're actually able to get the coin flipping property in steps 1 and 2 without any requirement on the dimension, no requirement, and in fact, not even any knowledge of the model for y given x. And we also don't need that sufficiency requirement for wj. I'm going to come back to that, but that's actually a really nice thing that came out of this work. So the one thing that I am assuming, that burden of knowledge is now on x. So I'm assuming that I know the distribution of x. This is certainly a non-trivial assumption. So I'm assuming that my rows, my samples of y, comma, x1 through xp, are sampled IAD from some distribution, and that I know the distribution of the x1 through xp. Not the x1 through xp given y, so this isn't a generative distribution, I'm just assuming that I know the marginal distribution of x1 through xp, that columns. And so I just want to, just a clarifying note, the rows of x must be IID, but not the columns. I'm not assuming independence among the columns. They can have any distribution, and that's what G is. I just have to know it. So I'm putting no constraints on the distribution, just saying that I know it. Nothing about y's distribution is assumed known, including its conditional distribution on x or vice versa. I'm not assuming anything about it, and in fact, I'm actually conditioning on it in my inference. So all of my FDR control guarantees will hold conditional on the values of y. And lastly, since this is definitely a non-trivial assumption, a big question we might ask is, how robust is this method to that assumption being violated? And so that's what I want to talk about on this slide. All right, so this slide takes a little bit of description to set up. So what I have is a AR1 set of covariates. So I have IID rows, and I have some dependent structure among the x's. And if I know it, then the power and FDR that I achieve is right here. If I know the exact covariance of the covariates, I get about 75% power, and I get a false discovery rate of 10%. We have theory that guarantees that this is right at 10%. So we don't have to worry about this being violated. But on the x-axis here, I'm going to plot the relative Frobenius norm error of an estimate of the covariance matrix. So if I don't actually know the distribution of x, and you give me an x, what do I have to do? I have to take the x's that I have and estimate their distribution, and then I would plug it in as if pretending I knew that distribution all along to this method. And so that's what I'm doing in this simulation. I have these x's, so I have an 800 by 1500 dimensional design matrix, so this is definitely high dimensional. And I'm going to try and estimate the covariance matrix by various methods. And when I do that, I'm going to look at the relative Frobenius norm error, so the Frobenius norm of the difference between my estimate and the true covariance matrix divided by the Frobenius norm of the true covariance matrix. And of course, this is an average over many, many simulations. Okay, so one thing I might do, because I know that this is AR1, if I don't really know it's AR1, but I think that the inverse covariance is sparse. Even if I don't know the structure, right? There's a strong spatial structure to an AR1 process as well. If all I think is that my inverse covariance is sparse, I might use something like the graphical lasso. And so if I do that, because this is still a high-dimensional covariance estimation problem, it's a really hard problem. We don't expect to do well in an absolute sense, and indeed, we're at about 50% error. So in an absolute sense, this is a pretty bad estimator, right, of the covariance matrix. And yet, our power and FDR are almost completely unchanged. Now I can make this estimator even worse by taking a convex combination. So suppose I don't even know that I have a sparse inverse covariance. Another thing I could do to make a worse estimator is to somehow take my empirical covariance matrix, which we know is a really bad estimator because it's singular, we're in high dimensions, it's going to be terrible, and somehow shrink it towards what I think maybe the true covariance might be. So what I'm going to plot next is a bunch of convex combinations between the empirical covariance matrix of the x I actually see and the true covariance matrix of that x. So when I do a 50-50 combination, I get, I bounce over 50% error, and I can do this a few times. So when I'm at about 75% empirical covariance, 25% true covariance matrix, I've reached about 100% Frobenius norm error. So again, this is a really bad estimate of the covariance matrix and of the distribution of x. And yet, I've only lost about 10% power, and my false discovery rate seems to still be controlled. Now I can take this all the way to the end. When I use 100% empirical covariance matrix, we know this is a terrible estimate. It's actually singular. And actually what ends up happening is it forces the knockoff variables to be exactly identical to the original variables so that we never have any power to discover any of them. And since we never report any discoveries, we have 0 power and 0 false discovery rate. Now there's a few things I think are interesting about this plot. So this is definitely a preliminary simulation. I didn't cherry pick this example at all. It's not like there were other examples where the false discovery rate went above nominal, but it's certainly not a comprehensive set of simulations either. But I think what's interesting is that what we're seeing as we move along the right axis is not just error in my estimate of x distribution. It's a specific kind of error. It's overfitting error, right? Because we have our data, we actually look at our data, and then we fit a model for x to our data, and then we pretend that we knew that all along. Now, if we did that in the canonical setting, where we look at y and x, somehow fit a model to y given x, for instance, by doing variable selection, and then pretended that we knew that model was true all along, and did, say, a t-test after running a lasso to do variable selection, we know that the false discovery rate would go off the charts here because we're overfitting to our distribution. And so none of the guarantees that come with a t-test normally are going to hold anymore. And we would really lose false discovery rate control. Well, our power would go up too, but it doesn't mean much if we lose false discovery rate control. What's interesting here is that the opposite effect seems to happen. The less we know, and thus the more that we overfit to our data, the more conservative we become. And I think this is something really fundamental to the model X approach as opposed to the approach that fixes X and models Y given X. Because the thing that we know less about is not actually our object of inference anymore. When we made assumptions about our object of inference and then overfit to it and then ask questions about it, which is what we're doing when we fit Y given X, and then ask a question about which variables are important, which is a question about Y given X, we are assuming we know more about the thing we're asking about than we actually do. Whereas here, because we're overfitting to X, which actually has nothing to do with the question we're asking about Y given X, we don't see that same overfitting effect, and we actually become more conservative that the less you know, the less power you have. And in some sense, that feels really satisfying as a statistician. That's sort of how it should be, right? You need some assumptions, you need some information in order to do inference in a high-dimensional problem. And this says that if you use this method, if you don't have a lot of information, what happens? You don't get the wrong answer, you just don't get to make a discovery. And so you know that you need more information, you need more data, but you never falsely report overconfidence in your answer. And I think that's really nice. Okay, so shifting the burden of knowledge is this thing I told you about. I'm going to maybe go a little quickly. So the things I want to have a data set where the x's are hopefully sampled from some population, and I want to know something about the distribution of x. Another nice thing is that I can use completely unsupervised data to improve my estimate of x. So I don't just have to look at my x's in sample. I can look at other x's that have been collected without the same corresponding y, bring those all together, and improve my estimate of the distribution of x. And I claim that this is actually not that unrealistic a setting in practice. So for instance, in genome-wide association studies, I think it fits the bill very well. So even in case control studies, we do have IID samples from some population. It's not the general population because we're oversampling cases, but it is IID samples from a population, so it's still no problem. We have a very strong spatial structure that's actually been studied quite a lot. It's well understood. We have good linkage disequilibrium models for the distribution of the mutations you have along your genome. Hidden Markov models have been very successfully employed by genomicists to do, for instance, data imputation. And so we can use those exact same models actually to model X and do our inference. And lastly, especially for human genomic problems, there are often the exact same set of SNPs, or the set of covariates, that are measured on totally different samples of humans, but compared to different response variables. And so we can actually bring those all together to have a much larger sample size for X and do a better job of estimating our distribution of X, even though we have much fewer samples in Y. So we can really use all three of these components, or all 1 and 2A and 2B, to do what we want. All right, so finally on slide 12, I'm going to tell you what this procedure actually is. So the first step is to construct knockoffs, and this is the property we require them to have. This is this pairwise swap exchangeability. So exchangeability, of course, is a very general thing. I'm saying a specific kind of exchangeability that when I take xj and I swap it with its knockoff, I don't change the distribution of x, right? There's no y's here. This is just equality in distribution with respect to x. And indeed, we actually are going to construct the knockoffs without looking at y at all. So we know that they're all null variables by our definition because we didn't even look at y when we constructed them. Excuse me, and thus they must be conditionally independent of y given all the real x's. Okay, so this is the property we need. We can see why we need to know the distribution of x because I can't even verify this property, an equality in distribution, if I don't know the distribution of x, right? Then in step 2, I have sort of a very simple algorithm and a very flexible algorithm that comes from the fact that I've gotten rid of the sufficiency requirement, which is that I need to pick a variable importance measure z. So I have this augmented data set, which is y and 2p x's, and I want to pick some way of measuring the importance of any variable among those 2p. And I'm going to call that variable importance measure z, so I can do it for any of my j, and that can be almost anything. And that's something that's really exciting about this and has a lot of connections with machine learning because we can use variable importance measures from all over the place. They just need to be some measure of variable importance. I'm really putting almost no constraints on this. All I need to do then is take z, measure it on the jth variable and the jth knockoff variable, that gives me zj and zj tilde, and plug them into an antisymmetric scalar valued function of two variables. So that just means when I swap the inputs, I get a minus sign front. And that's going to give me a valid knockoff statistic. And now steps 1 and 2, I'm going to prove in a second, actually give me the coin flipping property I need, and I can use the same step 3 to get the exact false discovery rate guarantee that we've always had. All right, so in step 1, the first question you might ask is, how do we actually know that we can construct a useful set of knockoffs for any given x distribution? So I told you there's no constraint on x's distribution, that you just have to know it. But it's not clear how we would actually construct knockoffs or that it's even possible. Well, we have a constructive proof that it is always possible to construct non-trivial knockoffs. Non-trivial, I just mean, of course, the trivial knockoffs would just be taking x and making x equal to x tilde. Those would be trivial knockoffs. They're certainly valid because swapping things doesn't change the distribution, but they're not useful because I'm always going to have 0 power. So those are the trivial knockoffs. But I can always construct non-trivial knockoffs by following the sequential algorithm that steps through all the variables and conditions on all the variables you've created so far, except for the one that you're creating a knockoff for, and builds knockoffs like this. We can prove that this is going to construct non-trivial valid knockoffs, and we can run this algorithm for any distribution for x. That said, that doesn't mean that this is a computationally efficient or particularly statistically powerful way of generating knockoffs. So instead, or in addition to this, we also thought about specific x distributions that we might be interested in. So as a statistician, of course, the first thing I tried was multivariate Gaussian. So when x's are multivariate Gaussian, the pairwise swap exchangeability property actually reduces exactly to this condition on the covariance matrix of the x's. I'm assuming the x's are mean 0 because I can always demean the x's. And you'll notice that this looks a lot like the geometric condition that we required in the original knockoffs paper, except that now it's being applied to the true covariance among these random variables as opposed to the empirical covariance among the actual observed design matrices. And so one of the things that means is, since we know what sigma is, because we assume that the distribution is known, we can find S in a really good way using, for instance, linear algebra and semi-definite programming. And the other thing I wanted to say is that for non-Gaussian x, so this is an exact way to construct knockoffs for multivariate Gaussian x. For non-Gaussian x, we could think of this as a second-order approximation to constructing knockoffs, right? So that pairwise swap exchangeability property said that these two things were equal in distribution. Well, if I follow this procedure, no matter what the distribution is, if I satisfy this procedure, then I have that these two objects are equal up to first and second moments. So it's sort of a second-order approximate construction of knockoffs. And so we might think that that's a reasonable starting point for doing knockoffs.
Is that what you do for normalized genotypes?
For normalized genotypes.
When you actually apply this to GWAS?
I'm going to get to that. Okay. So hold that question. It's a good question. Okay, so yeah, so we can use linear algebra and semi-definite programming to find S. So for multivariate Gaussian, we have a good computational solution for finding S and thus generating these knockoffs. Because once I know this joint distribution, it's easy for me to generate the conditional, the knockoffs conditional on the original variables using just normal theory. And then recently, there's a follow-up paper to this that showed that for Markov chains and for hidden Markov models, again, those were really the right model to use for genome-wide association studies, this algorithm here is actually quite fast. And you can sort of see why that might be. Markov chains only have local dependence. And so the fact that we keep growing this conditioning set, which would make things complicated in general, it doesn't really grow because you only ever care about your neighbors and your knockoffs neighbors, and your neighbors' knockoffs. And so they have a very fast construction for Markov chains and hidden Markov models. So these are settings where we know how to construct knockoffs in a powerful and computationally fast way. Which brings us to step 2. Once we have our knockoffs, we want to construct our knockoff statistics. So I'll quickly remind you that we construct these by having these variable importance measures and plugging them into an antisymmetric function. Something you might have in mind as an example is z might be the magnitude of the fitted coefficient on the lasso regression of y on the augmented design matrix. And f might be that simplest of antisymmetric functions, the difference between the two inputs. And that would give us what I call the lasso coefficient difference statistic, which just looks like this. This is something we tried, seemed to be pretty powerful. It's simple to understand and sort of is a running example. Okay, so now what I think is the most important slide of this talk, why do steps 1 and 2 actually give us the coin flipping property? So The exchangeability property that we've assumed holds is this one. I've just repeated it from the earlier slide. And what we want is coin flipping for null wj. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write zj and zj tilde. So these are the variable importance measures of the original and knockoff variables for the jth variable. I'm going to write these in their full functional form, right? They're functions of all the data, y and all the x's. And what I have from up here is that this is equal in distribution to if I just swap the two. And I've used now the fact that xj is null, because of course xj tilde is also null, because I didn't even look at y when I constructed it. And thus the fact that I can swap these without changing the distribution of the x's also means that I don't change the distribution jointly with y, because they're conditionally independent of y. So, so I have this, but I'm not done. The slightly more subtle fact is that z is measuring the importance, zj is measuring the importance of xj, but really it's measuring the importance of the values in that jth column of this augmented design matrix. And so when I actually swap these two, what this object is measuring is the variable importance of the values in the jth column, which are now x tilde j, the knockoff values, which means it's actually measuring the variable importance of the knockoff variable, which is exactly what this is doing. So actually, if I swap the tildes on the z's and swap back my x's, I get the exact same thing. And now we can just get rid of all the functional notation and see that what we proved is that zj tilde is equal in distribution to zj tilde zj. And now plugging this into our formula for w, so now I can swap the inputs with an equality in distribution and swap them back and get a minus sign using anti-symmetry. And I've just shown that wj is a symmetric random variable, which means its sign is a coin flip, and its sign is a coin flip even conditional on its absolute value. If I tell you of its absolute value, it tells me nothing about its sign, and its sign is still a coin flip, right? That's what a symmetric random variable's property is. Now, of course, all I've told you is that the coin flipping property holds marginally for the w's, but a very similar argument, just jointly over a group of zj tildes, would give you the same argument jointly over all the zj's, that not only do you have coin flip, you have independent coin flips. Okay, so now if the last slide was maybe the most important of the talk, I think this is maybe the most exciting slide of the talk. And it really comes from that removal of the sufficiency property for the wj's that allows me to use pretty much any variable importance measure for measuring, for trying to increase my power. So you'll recall I mentioned this lasso coefficient difference statistic that looks like this, but I didn't tell you, for instance, how to pick the penalty parameter for the lasso that I actually run, right? I have to estimate these coefficients somehow. I use a penalty parameter. How do I pick that penalty parameter? Well, a natural choice would be to use cross-validation. I think that's what we usually do. But in fact, already using cross-validation would not have been allowed in the original knockoffs framework because it wouldn't meet the sufficiency property, because you only use subsets of the data and it wouldn't fit the sufficiency property. So already we're allowed to do that. That gives us a little bit of adaptivity, right? If we have more signal, then we would use a weaker penalty and vice versa. And we could actually learn that from the data. But this is only a little bit of adaptivity. I think what's really exciting is that we can do really high-level adaptivity. So imagine a problem where you really don't know what y given x looks like. You don't even know whether it's smooth or really, really rough and choppy. And so what you could actually do is you could fit a random forest to your data and look at its cross-validation error. Also fit an L1 penalized regression and look at its cross-validated error. Pick whichever one has lower cross-validated error, right? We'd expect for a smooth function, probably the L1 penalized regression would do better. For a really choppy function, we might expect that the random forest would perform better. So we pick whichever one does better, derive a variable importance measure from that method. So like R random forest spits out a variable importance measure that has absolutely no statistical properties, but is a scalar value that somehow measures variable importance. So I could use that. And I'm still going to get exact false discovery rate control. So this is really high-level adaptivity to things I really have no idea about y given x. And in fact, I can even take that a step further. I don't even have to pre-specify what my procedure is for adapting to the data. I can actually show the analyst the data. So I can show them y and a slightly masked version of the data. So I can show them all of the unordered pairs xj, xj tilde. So they get to see y, they get to see all the values in xj, xj tilde, they just don't see which one is xj and which one is xj tilde. But they see all the pairs, and they see which j they correspond to, they just don't see which ones are knockoffs and which aren't. Then they can do whatever procedure they want to fit that thing, choose what variable importance measure to use, And then they can apply that variable importance measure to the original data, and they're still going to get exact false discovery rate control, because nothing about that, because they don't know what the ordering of the original knockoff variables are, changes the symmetry, breaks the symmetry that we actually use to get our coin flipping property. And so the analyst doesn't even have to decide ahead of time how he or she wants to adapt to the data. Now on the other side of the coin, suppose that we actually know a lot about what y given x probably looks like. So we don't need to adapt, but we want to actually imbue that prior information into the problem to improve our power. Well, a very natural way to do that is to take a Bayesian approach, right? So we could specify a model for our data. We could specify a prior for all the parameters in that model. And then we could, for instance, pick Zj to be the posterior probability that Xj actually contributes to that model. Or it could be anything, but this might be a natural choice, for instance, in Bayesian variable selection. Okay, so this seems like a very natural way to incorporate very strong prior information. And this is still going to get exact false discovery rate control, even if your prior is wrong, even if your model's wrong, and even if your computational approach, say MCMC, doesn't actually converge. None of those things are problems. These are all the things you might worry about as a Bayesian, especially in high dimensions. But none of those things are actually going to cause you a problem. We're still going to get exact false discovery rate control. Now, of course, if these things are really far off or your computation really doesn't work, you're not going to have much power because you haven't actually done anything useful. But you're still going to get false discovery rate control. And if you are right about these things and actually get them to work, that prior information that you imbue in the problem is going to give you a lot of extra power. Okay, and finally, let me walk you through this step 3, which I've referred to a bunch of times but haven't told you a lot about. So I'm going to do this by an example. So suppose Q is 20%, and we have 10 dimensions, so that I can actually plot these on a number line. So here are my WJs. I'm coloring their signs are denoted by color because I'm about to take their absolute values, because remember, we're going to order them by their absolute values. And we're going to start stepping through them, starting from the largest, going down. And I'm going to keep track of this thing, the number of negative WJs I've seen so far, divided by the number of positive WJs I've seen so far. I'm going to look at this curve. So when I see the first, I see positive, still positive, so my ratio is staying at 0, still positive, and now it jumps up. The first time I see a negative, and then it's going to go down as I see more positives. Then I'm going to see another negative, and I can finish this curve, right? So this is my curve of number of negatives over number of positives. And I told you I'm going to stop at the last time, moving in this direction, that I go below Q equals 20%. So that's right there. And I told you also that I'm only going to reject positive WJs. So I'm only going to reject the blue WJs to the right of this line. So note that I'm not rejecting W10. And this would be my selected set. All right, so this is my procedure. I think it's a little hard to see why I should be keeping track of this y-axis and why that has anything to do with Q or my nominal false discovery rate. So I want to give you a little bit of intuition for that. So remember that false discovery rate is our expected fraction of null xj selected divided by the total xj selected. Now by the definition of my selection procedure, for knockoffs, this is exactly just the number of null positive WJs that are above the tau hat threshold, divided by the number of positive WJs which are above that tau hat threshold. Right? This is just by definition of the knockoff procedure. But remember, by the coin flipping property, the numerator here is equal in distribution to the number of null negative WJs, right? Because these are all coin flips, even conditional on the absolute values. So there's a squiggly equals sign because although the numerator is equal in distribution, the joint distribution between the numerator and denominator is not necessarily equal. And indeed, this squiggly equals sign actually hides some very nice super martingale theory that makes it exact. But for now, intuitively, this is what happens. And then we can get rid of the word null to just get exactly what we were keeping track of on the y-axis. So you can think of this number of negatives divided by number of positives as sort of an FDR hat that we're keeping track of as we go down this path. And so then it seems a little more intuitively clear why we should stop at the last time our FDR hat goes below our nominal level Q. Okay. Now I'm going to go very fast through the numerical results so that I can get to the actual data analysis. Guess what? I'm going to show you some examples where our method is more powerful than other methods. Big surprise. Okay, ours is the black curve. Here's like all the things you could compare to in low-dimensional linear models. There actually are competitors here because this is a much easier problem. But we're more powerful than all of them, despite also all of them controlling the false discovery rate. Now we move to nonlinear models. We're dropping out competitors because different methods can't actually be applied here. But we see that the maximum likelihood approach doesn't control the false discovery rate at all. That's because of that histogram I showed you before. The p-values are invalid unless you're not controlling the false discovery rate. So you can ignore this green curve, and we're still the most powerful. Then in high dimensions, the only thing we can really compare to is marginal p-values, which are only valid if the covariates are completely independent. This is a very strong assumption on the joint distribution of the covariates. And as soon as we break that assumption, we see that marginal p-values aren't doing what we want. And even when they are doing what we want, our method is more powerful. OK, so that brings me now to the actual data set that I analyzed. So this is, I'll remind you, about 5,000 people, about 400,000 SNPs. And the first thing we did, in answer to your earlier question, is to use second-order knockoffs generated using a specifically designed for GWAS data covariance estimate by Wen and Stevens in 2010. So this thing actually not only uses a lot of structure that we know, biological knowledge, to better estimate the covariance matrix, it actually uses outside data from the HapMap data set, the 1,000 genomes data set, to regularize the problem. And so in some sense, it's also using an unsupervised approach because that data is built into the procedure. The entire analysis took only about 1 hour because we parallelized it. If we unparallelized it, it would have taken all of 6 hours, which for this size of data set I think is pretty good. We have R and MATLAB packages already done. You can find them through my website. They're linked on there. I would certainly love to hear if you find any bugs or have problems with them or hear anything about your experience with them. And then as I mentioned before, we made about twice as many discoveries as the original analysis. Some of those were discovered to have already been found in this newer study, which had much more data. So that seems promising, right? They confirmed what we found, or we confirmed what they found. And then actually some of the ones that weren't discovered in that new study, I actually looked up where they lay on the genome. And so for each SNP, I looked at what the nearest gene was. And for some of the ones that weren't confirmed in the later study, the nearest gene had actually been independently found to be related to Crohn's disease. So these are actually SNPs that no one has said, oh, we think these are related to Crohn's disease, but they seem like very promising candidates because I just happened to, it seems very unlikely that I selected some gene that happens to be right next to, that I selected some SNP that happens to be right next to a gene which actually has independently been found to be related to Crohn's disease. And then the second part of my answer to that question is that this newer paper, which actually uses the exact software that genomicists use to impute X, and thus model X, reruns knockoffs using the hidden Markov model assumption that again, genomicists make. So I think this is a much more justifiable model. So they redo this analysis, and they make very similar discoveries. They get a very similar result to ours. There's a slight increase in power. Their average number of discoveries was like 22 instead of 18. But the actual discoveries they make are very similar. This is promising. I think there's no question to me that this is the right way to do it. But I wasn't on that paper, so it seems a little unfair for me to just present that work. So, but I think this is absolutely the right way to do it now that we know how to do HMM knockoffs. And I think that it's promising that they get a very similar result. It suggests some sort of robustness of the procedure.
So you use the second order thing that sort of mimics the Gaussian case,
Mm-hmm.
and they use the HMM
Correct.
thing using a kind of Lee-Stevens like.
They used fast phase.
Okay, for this very case.
Yep. So they use the exact model fit from that. And I don't have time for this, so don't worry about it. This just shows that if I were to resample the x's and re-estimate x's distribution from those resampled x's, so I'm actually going to have the exact same estimation error as I had in my real problem. So this is another robustness simulation. So what I'm saying is I take my x's that are actually in my sample, so they come from their true distribution even though I don't know what it is. I subsample them, so those are also IID samples from that true distribution. And I use the same fitting process I used on my real data to estimate the distribution of those x's. But now I simulate y's from a known model so that I can actually tell how well I'm doing. And here what this is just showing is that for a range of known models, even though I know that I'm making the same kind of misspecification error on my distribution of x's, I still seem to get very tight false discovery rate control for a range of models, which again lends support to the idea that what we're doing isn't too crazy, that we're probably controlling our errors, and we've already seen that we're getting powerful results. So yeah, I think I'm just about at time, so I'll just say some next steps. On the theoretical side, we really want to understand this robustness a lot better. Again, we have some empirical results, which I think are very suggestive and promising, but we want more theoretical guarantees. There's already a few groups working on this, and I have some ideas of my own. but this is definitely maybe priority number one. On the methodological side, we want to develop knockoff constructions for new interesting X distributions. So the first question is, what are interesting X distributions? Other ones that people use to model their data that they would want to use knockoffs with, and thus we need to come up with good ways of constructing knockoffs for. And then we need to come up with that. And then lastly, on the applied side, sort of related, we want to try and apply this in other settings. So genome-wide association studies was sort of easy because we were able to obtain that data set freely online, although free means a lot of time spent applying through dbGaP. But we hope to work more closely with a little more up-to-date than 2007 data sets directly with the scientists obtaining them to analyze new and exciting things and hopefully make discoveries where really the data analysis tools for making those discoveries didn't exist before. And that's it. Thank you. Yeah, questions? Please.
So very interesting talk. I'm curious, so one assumption of your model was that you are sampling from, independently from a population.
Mm-hmm.
So could you comment on the situation where you might have, a pool of people, but they are not exchangeable? So you know that, they might have related diseases, but it's not exactly the same. So could you comment on how your model could be adapted in a more hierarchical kind of fashion population?
Yeah, so first of all, yeah, that IAD assumption was mainly for simplicity. It makes a lot of things much easier to describe. But in principle, as long as you know the full joint matrix distribution of X, then in principle, you can construct knockoffs. It's a lot easier when that full distribution really just amounts to IAD row distributions. And then we only really have to construct row-wise knockoffs, and the problem kind of separates. But in principle, if we had, for instance, time series nature along the rows, we could think about trying to construct knockoffs that way. It's not something we have thought about, but it's definitely an interesting question.
Or population structure and relatedness among individuals.
Yeah, so that's actually that. So
Still think of that as IAD, depending.
That's the thing is you are still IAD sampling, right? Unless you knew that they were related ahead of time and sampled them because of that, you are still IAD sampling from a distribution. And so I think in genomics, you actually don't have to worry about this problem, right? The samples in this GWAS certainly were related to some extent, right? But we don't know what that was. They are still IAD samples from the population of UK residents in this case. Yeah?
Can you show slide 14? This is the HMM assumption, right?
HMM assumption. So it's a lot of clicking. There we go.
So in the algorithm about this
Yeah?
Conditional distribution,
Mm-hmm.
how do we know that?
Because we assume that we know the full joint distribution of X, right? So then certainly we know all the conditional distributions. Remember, that was my assumption.
Isn't it that the drawback to the whole? I mean, if you assume you know it and you draw from it, you're going to get what you assume.
Yeah, of course. So, well, you're not going to get exact same samples, but you're going to get something that mimics those samples, which is sort of the point of knockoffs. Yeah, so that's the assumption we're making, right? We're trading off assumptions. We don't have to make any assumptions on Y. I claim knowing the distribution of X is not any stronger of an assumption than knowing that Y follows a linear model. They're both reducing a very exponential space down to a linear space.
And practically, you use some joint distribution for the conditionals, or you bootstrap it, or?
No, yeah, usually we assume some knowledge of the joint distribution, like in the genome-wide association study data. And then from that implies these conditional distributions. But again, we're not actually, well, in the hidden Markov model case, yes, we do. Like the hidden Markov model, essentially, that joint distribution is almost defined by its conditional distributions, right? It's
also, if you know the joint, you don't necessarily know the conditionals exactly, right? For every,
You do? Yeah.
For every distribution?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is a, computationally, you may have a hard time sampling from it, which is why I said that this may not be a computationally fast algorithm. But in principle, you do know it, right? If you can sample from the joint distribution, you can sample from the conditional distribution given infinite time, right? The question is whether that's fast or not. And that's why we've done some work making sure that we can actually do this thing in finite time, in fast time, not just finite time. for certain distributions. And so that's definitely a question. This is really a proof tool to show that we could do this in principle. Computation is a different question, an important question. Other questions? Yeah?
At the last slide, you mentioned that one of the examples you plan on applying this to is climate change.
Mm-hmm.
Have you already started doing that work?
No.
No? Oh,
So if you know something about it, I'd love to talk to you.
okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, all right. Thank you.